Air Force witnesses, George Filer, who actually has gone to start a site where he compiles a lot of cases, and he's an Air Force guy who was present when the ET was shot and killed on the tarmac there near McGuire Air Force Base and back some years ago, and he's one of the Disclosure Project witnesses, and he had said to me years ago in an interview that through the force of ridicule and the use of the media and movies and everything to ridicule and create a social opprobrium around the subject, a sort of a distasteful thing that people won't talk about this issue because of the fear of ridicule and rejection, as you're talking about, from their peerage, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, or a professor, or whatever. And interestingly, that's why it's so important to have credentialed people, credible people come forward with information, data, documents, and what have you, who say, look, yes, this subject has been the butt of a lot of jokes and a lot of comedy, and there is a lot of nonsense in this field. However, these facts are true. And that's what we've tried to do with Disclosure, and it's what we've done with all of these subjects. But it is, we are obviously up against this propaganda machine that got rolled out before I was born and before you were born. So there's a conditioning out there, but I believe that has changed because, when we started this effort, about a third of the Majestic group, just so you know, the so-called cabal, were in favor of what I was recommending to Bill, President Clinton and the CIA director I met with. Now I understand it's more like two-thirds, although they're still very intimidated by the ruthless far end of it. About 30% of the public thought that ET life existed and UFOs were real. Now it's in the 50 to 60% range. And in fact, 43% in a recent poll that just came out 2 months ago of the public think that they're here frequently on the Earth, not just that they exist in space or may have visited the Earth. So the point I'm making is that there has been a huge shift on this, and yet within, quote, polite circles and academic circles in the mainstream media, this is still very much the giggle factor stepchild of news, and that's something that is going to need to change, and we hope to see that it changes further, but ultimately it changes by one person at a time coming out, speaking their truth, sharing the information, and then pointing to people to the credible evidence, documents, videos, photos of ET craft, top secret guys coming forward. Because I know that when I was on the Joe Rogan show, he didn't know, a lot of his listeners didn't know that we had that much evidence sitting around. But, of course, it is. But you have to go and look at it and read it. We're going to try to make it a lot more available because, we've never really had a professional webmaster and website, and that's what we're building right now. And before April 22nd, when we have the world premiere of the film Sirius in Los Angeles, we're going to have all of that information up so that the film will then link into the site, and there will be, because in 2 hours of the film you can only get a little bit of evidence, but then there'll be just dozens, thousands of bits of information and whatnot in one place as sort of a clearinghouse, and that will be very exciting. I hope to even have the entire briefing I put together for President Obama in 2009 in there, at least the parts that I'm allowed to put in.
Well, that actually brings up another subject that I was already wanting to ask you. Maybe telepathically you got that.
Yeah.
Or not. It could just be that I'm just taking an opportunity. But I was recently tapped to be in a very, very popular television show, and I will not say which television show. But the production company contacted me, and they handed me a list of questions, and they spoke to me on the phone.
Right.
The focus of the show, because they had seen that I was doing some really intense conspiracy theory type stuff on the Internet, the focus of the show, and they basically came right out and told me in the questions what they wanted. They wanted to take all of this stuff that's going on with people starting to wake up to the things that are going wrong in the world, and they wanted me to blame American presidents for all the problems. They wanted as many specific stories as I could come up with for American presidents causing all the problems in the world. And I had this phone consultation with them, and I said, look, The bottom line is you got oligarchs who have had dynastic financial control. This goes back to the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church. The Rothschilds took over Europe. The Rockefellers took over America. They pooled their resources into the Federal Reserve System. The U.S. dollar was outsourced in 1913. It's lost 96% of its value since then. $26 trillion were paid in bailouts to private banks, many of which were not American, and that's almost half of the global GDP.
Right.
I don't think the problem is the president. And then they said, they called me back 3 days later, or they wrote me back and said, well, the team has decided to go in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, and, here's one of the problems. Everyone's looking for a scapegoat, and I always tell people, the emperor has no clothes. One of the embarrassing moments, it wasn't an embarrassing moment. It was a poignant moment. And I'm sitting here, and imagine, I'm a 30-some-year-old medical doctor who's flown up to Washington to brief the sitting CIA director at his request on this subject.
Wow.
Just
that's crazy.
Put your mind around that for a moment. And, at the end of the meeting, it was almost a 3-hour meeting, I have a white paper that's in my first book, Extraterrestrial Contact, the Evidence and Implications. And one of the recommendations, there's a set of recommendations for the CIA director and the president of actions that need to be taken dealing with bringing this information out, the technology out, and stopping the secrecy. And the CIA director, Woolsey, looked at me and he said, Dr. Greer, how do we disclose that which we have no access to?
Wow.
Now imagine standing in a room with a sitting CIA director, and the guy was not joking, and he was very emotional about it. And it was one of these things where, the average person thinks that, well, you're the president, you have an all-access pass. But the truth is closer to what Jimmy Carter said not too long ago at a dinner party. I had a friend who was at an event with him who's a classical guitarist, and someone had said, what was it like being the most powerful man in the world? And President Carter said, well, I don't think I was that man. and someone at the dinner party, I guess there were about 20 people there, said, what do you mean? And President Carter, who actually I just saw at the inauguration here in Washington, he said, look, the fact is there were things I didn't have a high enough clearance to know about. And someone in the room said, oh, things like UFOs, sort of in a ridiculing way.
Right.
And President Carter said, yes, that and more.
Oh.
And they said you could have heard a pin drop. And so, there's this sort of misunderstanding. And the reason Eisenhower, who had, of course, enormous credibility in the military, he's a 5-star general and a Republican all through, World War II, and then president for 2 terms. When he said, beware the military-industrial complex, the big issue, of course, was the fact that the UFO subject and its associated projects within the defense establishment had gotten reorganized under the Rockefeller Commission of 1956, I believe it was, and he had lost complete control over the levers of power on this issue, and he knew it. And we have a witness, a lawyer, Mr. Lubkin, who actually testified to that effect when he was in the Eisenhower White House as a young Army Signal Corps guy, and that's in our disclosure materials, that he was at meetings where Eisenhower was lamenting the fact that, he would get reports about UFO events, but the whole projects dealing with them were out of his control, and he was very angry and very frustrated by it. So people, need to have, I have a lot of actual compassion for some of these folks that I've met with who are at the Pentagon in senior positions. I briefed the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a 3-star general, as well as the head of intelligence for the Joint Staff. And these were men who were very high up in our Defense Department who had inquired about this issue and been denied access, just like the CIA director. So then the question becomes, who's really running this show? Well, it gets back to what you just said, David. It's something that's gotten up and basically subverted democracies around the world, and it runs as its own polity, as its own organizational nexus.
And the oldest power structures are still the most important ones. I mean, Roman Empire, Catholic Church, and I've heard that the Pope did not resign because he didn't feel good.
Well, there were a lot of problems. I'm going to leave that. I have bigger fish to fry, but I'll just tell you, I will say this. When I've been at the Vatican meeting with very senior people, senior theologians to the Pope and others, and there is widespread support, but not unanimous support, for not only disclosure but peaceful contact. And I love the interview I did some years ago with Monsignor Balducci, who is a senior theologian to Pope John Paul. And he and I spoke very frankly about this. And after I did the interview, which is in Italian, unfortunately, but we're going to try to get a full translation up and out fairly soon. But he turned to me and he said, I couldn't be having this discussion with you unless Papa, meaning the Pope, wanted me to.
Whoa.
And he said some amazing things. Before that, I had some meetings with people with the Vatican Security Service and Intelligence Service because they knew of the briefing that we had put together and then the best available evidence that Lawrence Rockefeller had put together for Bill and Hillary Clinton at the ranch there, the JY Ranch out in the Tetons, that I visited some years ago, and that they really were very interested. In fact, they said, "Would you allow us to have that briefing?" I said, "Of course. I mean, I'm not doing anything secretive at all with this." The same thing I said to the British royal family when they asked for that briefing, which was hand carried by an actor at a premiere some years ago in London to Prince Charles. So I think what people have to understand is that a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff is wrong because it's painted with a very broad brush, and like these folks were trying to get you to say, well, these presidents are all. I'm going, you know what? I'm not saying that they have no say-so over anything, but on some of this stuff, it's so many compartments above anything they're briefed on. And if they are told any of it, David, it's manipulative rubbish designed to get them to do things that the cabal want done. For example, there's a colonel I know who talked about providing alien threat scenarios to Ronald Reagan to get him to support the SDI Star Wars weapon systems in space. And I said, yeah, of course. They're going to say certain things, and it's all manipulative. But the truth is,
and one of my
most of it's deceptive.
One of my insiders told me that Reagan was going to tell the public the truth about UFOs, and then bam, he gets shot.
Right.
So that's one of these things that we're starting to find out. It's like all these historical events have to be reinterpreted.
They all have to be reinterpreted. And, of course, after we provided all this briefing material to the Obama administration upon request, he went to, in his first few months of his term, went and got the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, and that's when that Oslo spiral, the blue spiral, appeared over Oslo, and everyone, of course, it was on CNN and Anderson Cooper and everyone talking about it.
It was less than 24 hours before he got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes, and what's interesting is that a week before that happened, there were two separate people who don't know each other from the intelligence community says there's only a few of us on this planet who are going to know what that is. What's going to happen? And I said, what are you talking about? He says, well, they said, just wait and see. And then this event happened. And, of course, I know that it was a very human, what's called scalar or longitudinal weapon test fire over Norway. And it was a shot across the bow to scare people. The administration.
I wrote a massive investigation on that called Disclosure Endgame. People can look on my website, divinecosmos.com. And in that investigation, I showed unequivocal evidence that HAARP can be pulsed to make those spirals.
Of course, absolutely.
And you and I talked about this backstage at one of your events, and actually that was the first time I met you. I think it was in Atlanta. And other than the Disclosure Project 2001, that's the first time I reacquainted myself with you. But you had said something to me about how somebody told Obama, whispered in his shoulder, you really wouldn't like it if your plane flew one of those, would you?
He flew into one of these, yeah. Right. And so I think this is, and when Carter was pushing on this and had the White House study group trying to get into the bottom of the UFO issue, there were two people who came into the Oval, the president's private office, that's right off the Oval Office, and said, sir, if you would like to complete your first term as president, you will keep your mouth shut about this. So, this kind of stuff is why. And here's the reason why you and I and everyone listening have to be the people to do. People say, when is disclosure going to happen? I said, we're doing it. And as you point out, as more and more of these movements take on momentum, and we're hoping the film Sirius will really push that momentum, we'll have more and more of these whistleblowers coming forward. And we'll have the ability to bring the science and technology out. Because ultimately, if at some point we can prove the energy generation science behind